The student leader is James Gialella from SUNY Binghamton at the Newman House. And James is a sophomore studying history and public health. He intends to work in public health for a Catholic health organization after graduation. Yay, go James. And he studies theology in his free time, and his favorite church father is St. Augustine, which makes me love you because I love Augustine. So welcome, James, to give Dr. Franks an introduction.
Thank you. So we are excited to welcome Dr. Angela Franks, our second guest speaker for today. Dr. Franks is currently serving as professor of theology at St. John's Seminary in Boston and as a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute in Cambridge. She is also the president-elect for the Academy of Catholic Theology for 2024 to 2025, as well as a Life and Dignity Writing Fellow for the University of Notre Dame's Church Life Journal. Her numerous works include papers, chapters, and books spanning many topics and specialties, including the body, identity, the Trinity, Christology, and the thoughts of John Paul II and Hans Urs von Balthasar. Dr. Franks is currently finishing a 2-volume book manuscript entitled The Body and Identity. The first volume, Bodies and Empty Shelves, and the second, Theological and Philosophical Anthropology. Her lecture for us today is titled Liquid Identity, Our Current Situation and How We Can Respond. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Franks for her lecture and all the work that she's done.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Is there anybody here from Harvard, from the Harvard Catholic Center? Hey, yay, I'm not the only Bostonian. I'm Catholic, but I'm not like from Harvard, so I'm glad you guys are here. I'm really happy to be here. This is the stuff I'm going to talk about overlaps really nicely with what Stephen talked about, but also gives a different sort of take. So you can tell me what you think about it. I'm going to be using, here's my clicker, here it is. The clickers are like the most sensitive things in the world. Yep, you're going to have more tech support. It's like, why? Why would it just work? Oh, yeah. So while he's doing that, I'll just explain a little bit about this metaphor. I'm going to be using a metaphor from a sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman, and he talks about liquid modernity. There we go. Awesome. Thank you. So liquid modernity, he developed this idea in numerous books beginning around the year 2000. They're all good, but they're all kind of the same book. So if you read one, you've basically read them. So what does he mean? He draws a distinction between liquid modernity and solid modernity. So there he is. He passed away pretty recently. So according to Bauman, solid modernity privileges size, stability, institutions, comprehensiveness, clarity. It's like the age of exploration, conquering space. So you can think of encyclopedias, Versailles, if you've ever been there, very solid, very big, the Ford factory. He determined that beginning in what we sometimes people call like post-modernity. So like he started noticing around the 1980s that there was a different kind of modernity, which he calls liquid modernity. So if solid modernity wants to conquer space, liquid modernity wants to conquer time. So speed, flexibility, choice, portable devices, battery power becomes really important in liquid modernity. Why this liquidity? Why do people prize what he calls liquidity? So Bauman explains that when fluids are subjected to stress, and there's scientists in here who know this way better than I do, right? When fluids are subjected to stress, they flow out of the way of the force, right? Whereas if a solid is subjected to enough stress, it's going to break. And so, if you try to take a jackhammer to this desk, things will break, right? Try to take it to BB Lake over there, if I pronounced it right? Like it's just, the water just flows out of the way, right? And so people prize liquidity because it feels stronger. The flexibility feels stronger. So people, instead of the solid of the family, people choose the liquid of cohabitation. Weak ties, strong instead of strong bonds, right? Maybes, maybe I'll go, maybe I won't, instead of yeses or nos, because it feels like we have, we have more options, and that flexibility feels good. So I don't know if anybody here reads Gilles Deleuze, not that I really recommend it, but it's like crazy and wacky, but it's really kind of our world. So I find that really helpful. And as he wrote with his co-author, Guattari, who never gets put on the PowerPoint slides, flows, who doesn't desire flows, and relationship between flows and breaks in flows. So that really summarizes liquid modernity. So a few things about Bauman's thought. So he doesn't really go into the history that much. He's a sociologist, kind of a theoretical sociologist, but still. You can see this kind of liquidity beginning already in what he calls solid modernity. So in, kind of in even the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, because modernity deliberately rejects truth and purpose. So if you know your Aristotle, this is formal cause and final cause. Modern thinkers and scientists explicitly reject truth and purpose. And so that means, therefore, that the world gets opened up to being about whatever you want it to be, whatever you can make it be about, right? And so this is already within modernity, within solid modernity, kind of the seeds of liquidity. But what the interesting thing is that this is almost always done in modernity in the name of freedom, right? That if we have fewer constraints, fewer solid institutions will be freer. But what actually happens is that people feel paralyzed by choice, right? They have so many options, they have no idea what to do with it, where to go. They don't know how to choose the good because they've been told there isn't really a good, it's just what's good for you, right? And so this ends up paralyzing people. So further, and leading to my next section, the question of who am I becomes really important. So I chose on the left there a picture of the castle of Heidelberg, because that's where my family settled. So, say 1,000 years ago, right? If you were asked the who am I question, you would give answers that would be very solid according to Bauman's terms, right? You would, my family probably would have said, well, we're serfs, working the lands of the Lord of Heidelberg, and we're Christians, at least nominally. And like you would choose answers from family, from class, from location. These are very solid realities. On the right-hand side, we've got, the guy in the mid-century modern apartment looking out the window saying, who the heck am I, right? So now the identity question has all of those things: class, place, religion, like even human nature itself, like all of these things have been liquefied. And so instead of finding our answers in these very solid realities, now we're thrown into this liquid state. And so we just are trying to figure it out. And we have all of these identity strategies to do that. So I'll talk a little more about liquid identity shortly, but one thing I want to already put into your mind right now is that really the great historical solvent in liquefying the move from the left kind of solid realities to the right, probably the most important historical solvent was actually Christianity, right? If you think about it, as Paul says in Galatians 3:28, there is no Jew or Greek, no slave or free, no man or woman. Not that Paul was a gender fluidity person. I can answer a question in the Q&A if you want. But in other words, these very solid categories of finding identity that were common in the pre-modern world, Christianity is the most unsettling factor to intervene into those categories and say no. Thomas Aquinas's family said, you're going to go be the monk at Monte Cassino. It's going to be, you'll be the abbot. It'll be very prestigious. And God's call comes in and lifts him out of his family and out of his social class and makes him a beggar, right? Which Dominicans are, right? That's a very Christian way of understanding identity. I am pro-Christianity. I'm in favor of it. But we have to recognize that once you lose the theistic context, the solid realities that Christianity has liquefied are no longer there for people to fall back on. So it's Christianity in many ways that sets this liquefying process in motion. And then secularism, as we're kind of at the tail end of it, but the secularism that's been going on for hundreds of years leads us to the point where we really have an identity crisis. All right, let's get into liquid modernity more more precisely. So, and obviously very noisy kind of hot topic around the question of liquid identity would be something like gender fluidity, which I've written on. I'm not going to talk about that here, but again, I could, answer questions. But I think it's really helpful for us to realize how, for all of us, our identities are pretty fluid in the modern world, right? And so it can help us. Sometimes it's really tempting for people who aren't attracted to the whole gender fluidity narrative to just be like, those people are crazy. And like, that's another thing we could talk about, but it's helpful for us to be able to see, like, why do they find that helpful? Like, why do they find that attractive? If we can find things in us that are kind of on the same spectrum, then that can help us actually evangelically be in a better position to talk to people like that. So I won't talk about gender fluidity, but I am going to talk about these 5 things, which Bauman talks about. The hard work that goes into creating an identity, so therefore the need for identity shortcuts and performative identities, the tenuous nature of liquid community and relationships, and the oscillation between security and freedom. So we'll start with the first one, the labor of self-creation. Self-creation is simply a modern reality. By modern, I mean like going back to like early modernity, 16th century, but especially 17th century and beyond. Bauman calls it the fact that the burden of pattern weaving and the responsibility for failure fall primarily on the individual's shoulders, right? So we have all of this freedom where we don't have to pay attention to these solid categories. On the one hand, on the other hand, that means now my identity is my job. I have to make myself, right? So self-creation becomes really important. So Bauman says this means that we live in a state of permanent transformation, perpetually redefining oneself through becoming someone other than one has been thus far, and becoming someone else amounts to ceasing to be what one has been, to breaking and shaking off one's old form as a snake does its skin or a shellfish its carapace. Rejecting and hoping to wipe out one by one the used up, worn out, too tight, or just not as satisfying personae as they are revealed to be in comparison with new and improved opportunities and offers. So that was an extended quote from Bauman. So if all of that sounds exhausting, it is, right? And so that's why we have identity shortcuts, right? So a lot of when people criticize contemporary identity, a lot of it is centered around identity politics, both from the right and the left. There's a lot of criticism of identity politics, which by and large I share. But I think it's helpful to realize that identity politics serve this role because we're like exhausted trying to create ourselves. And we want to so Bauman in another place calls them like pre-made suits off the rack, right? I'm just going to grab this identity, I'm going to put it on, and it's going to help me. So he says it's a quote, a set of straightforward must do and mustn't do rules. Individual actors are pressed, nudged, and cajoled to put their confidence in authorities, influencers maybe, right? Trusted to decide and spell out what exactly the unspoken demand commands them to do in this or that situation. So this is in, that's out, right? White walls, or maybe academic Gothic or whatever it was that I heard recently, right? So this kind of recreation is fueled by market forces as well, right? Because if you're constantly trying on and rejecting identities, you're probably gonna have to buy a lot of stuff, right? To make your identity work. And so Bauman says, quote, the major threat to a society that announces customer satisfaction to be its motive and purpose, the major threat to that society is a satisfied customer, end quote, right? Because then they're not going to buy anymore. All right, so then the third point, the performative identities. So we seek identity shortcuts, but primarily with an eye to how those identities appear. Right. So we're really concerned with how we are presenting ourselves into the world. And so Judith Butler, who's a gender theorist, no accident coined this term performativity the way that we generally use it. So instead of being preceding action, which if you know anything about kind of classical medieval philosophy, the idea is you are, and based on who you are, what you are, then you can act in a certain set of ways. That's kind of classical philosophy. In contrast to that, acting, you act yourself into being, right? What do you want to be? Okay, so you've got to now figure out the script. You've got to buy the right clothes or buy the right things in order to act yourself into becoming in identity. All right, so this is obviously reinforced and put on steroids by the digital world, which is mostly something that was that Bauman was mostly writing before the digital world really took off. So in that sense, he was very prescient. But the internet is a place where people perform identities. And to some degree, that's only what it is for a lot of people, right? Like really social media has become essentially a place where you perform an identity for other people's applause or rejection, God forbid, in which case you've got to change your identity now, right? But it also relieves the need to be consistent in your identity, right? You can open up an anonymous account on Twitter and like write, you know, the most disgusting racist tweets if you want, and nobody will know that it's you, presumably, who's, you know, on Instagram is this whole, you know, totally other, you know, progressive person, for example, right? So you can try out all of these identities in the internet in a way that seems cost-free, right? It seems like this is my place to be able to do these different things. So all of this affects the fourth thing, liquid community. Solid communities have mostly, so like, you know, it's if sometimes people are like, why does society attack the church so much? Why does society attack the family so much? Like Bauman's answer to that is they are the most solid realities we still have, right? The church is like, seems like really big, rich, though people don't know that it's not actually, but you know, it's this really big, solid institution. So we're left with liquid communities. And at the micro level, Bauman says that these have become networks. Quote, the difference between a community and a network is that you belong to a community, but a network belongs to you. You feel in control, end quote, right? So you're at the center of your network, like a spider inside your web, right? If you go to an ordinary, fairly solid community, it's going to put demands on you. You know, it's going to say, okay, like you want to join the Knights of Columbus. We've got this membership, this secret membership process that I know nothing about, but that involves swords, apparently. Or, you know, like you want to join a sorority or whatever, like they're going to put demands on you, right? But in a network, you're in the middle of it. At the macro level, what's replaced community is a swarm, Bauman argues. Quote, in a liquid modern society, swarms tend to replace groups with their leaders, hierarchies, and pecking orders. A swarm can do without those paraphernalia, without which a group could not exist. Still Bauman here, a swarm has no top, no center. It is solely the direction of its current flight that casts some of the self-propelled swarm units into the position of leaders to be followed for the duration of a particular flight, though hardly longer, end quote. Okay, so this brings us to the last characteristic of liquid modern identity, security versus freedom. And Bauman is really insightful in the push-pull relationship between security and freedom in liquid modernity. And you would think, because it's liquid modernity in general seems to be like 100% freedom. It's like all in on freedom. But in fact, nobody really wants to live in a place where they have no security, no constancy, no stability. So there's this push-pull between the two. The kind of security that the strength of liquidity, again, is its flexibility, right? And the kind of security that liquidity gives requires a lot of attention on the individual's part, right? It's like, I need to find my tribe for at least this particular moment in my life, but I have to go out and find them, right? It's not like I can assume the tribe is somehow automatically there and is going to take care of me. So Bauman argues, rather than being a matter of roots or embeddedness, identities today are more like dropping and weighing anchor, right? You drop anchor, you're there for a bit, you're like, okay, I'm out of here. So here's a quote from him. Unlike uprooting and disembedding, there is nothing irrevocable, let alone ultimate, in weighing anchor. Anchors are drawn up only to be dropped again elsewhere, and they can be dropped with similar ease at many different and distant ports of call, end quote. So the kind of community that we have here is very tenuous, and it's defined by my opting in or out. Further, if you think about the fact that ports of call don't necessarily make demands on you, right? It's like you go in and you sample it for a bit and then you leave. So a political theorist, Pierre Manon, who, as far as I know, isn't using Bauman's categories at all, he points out that because modernity has rejected truth and purpose, formal and final causality, we can't, as communities, create an identity around pursuing a commonly shared good. Or at least if you do, you've had to deliberately decide to do that. Because officially in modernity, we don't believe in goods, right? We don't believe in truth. We don't believe in a good thing. So this is why, instead of an injunction to pursue a commonly recognized good, what we instead have is the injunction to tolerate. Right. So the emphasis on toleration is precisely because there's this vacuum created by the rejection of goods and purposes. So that's why toleration is not a courtesy anymore. It's a demand, right? You must tolerate because that's the structure of our system. The problem is that this actually works very badly. So Bauman explains the paradox, because, if somebody's just affirming you just because they're supposed to tolerate you, that's not actually very affirming, right? Like they're not really recognizing any good in you that they're affirming. They're just tolerating you because they have to, because they're going to supposedly get in trouble if they don't, right? So Bauman says, emancipation of the self and its effective self-assertion needs strong and demanding communities. But confirmation capable of completing the labor of self-creation can only be offered by an authority, right? So like if you create yourself as some niche internet personality that's promoted by some influencer, the ultimate affirmation is when the influencer affirms you as the authority, right? Like that's where you really feel like you belong. But the problem is that we have refused the kind of structures that would create authorities. In theory, nobody's supposed to be an authority, right? That's part of the liquidity. So we want to be affirmed, but we are not allowing ourselves to have people whose affirmation we would really trust, right? Because we don't have any official authorities. All right, so let's take stock. We are in a liquid modern age. You can argue the extreme edge of that might be in gender fluidity, species fluidity is a thing, but this actually impacts us all. Liquidity is especially challenging the formation of identity, which requires some kind of strong, solid structure. So we have an identity crisis that has been initiated by modernity and in particular by liquid modernity. And the result is identity politics, which evades all spheres, including, I believe, traditional religion, certainly including Catholicism, which is my area of experience, but I'm sure other more traditional kinds of religion too. People seek easy identity formation, but the thing is that because it's so easy, they can quickly leave without a lot of demands on them. And our online environment facilitates the formation of quick and superficial identities that then can be rejected. All right, so probably this all sounded horrible. If you're here, you're probably not like, I want to live with no authorities and no solidity in my life at all. That's probably not the audience I'm talking to. So what I'd like to do is try to pivot a little bit and talk about what is the good desired in liquid modernity. And I have a visual for this because I haven't showed you any pictures of my kids yet, so it's time to show you some pictures of my kids. But I think this particular video really, there's no sound, don't worry. It really symbolizes what we like about liquidity. Mine are the ones moving. Yep. There they go. This is like, they see a hill and they're like, I must climb it and run down it. Like, why? Why do you do that? And I love this little thing right here. Like, gravity works again. Yes, right. So why does it feel so good to run downhill? Like, why do we like flow and movement and all of this kind of thing? Why is it in a world that has always had elements of liquid and solid, you know, for all of human history, why do we zig liquid when everybody else zagged solid, right? Like, why, what is it that we're seeing in this? So to do this, when I want to answer questions, I often say, what does the Bible say about this? And I literally have done a word study of what the Bible says about water. And it's actually really helpful to see, like, what can you see in the New Testament? And in particular, it's very interesting to read the Gospels, paying attention to all the verbs of movement that are there. So this is clearest in the Gospel of Luke, where half of it is essentially Jesus's long journey to Jerusalem. So you have that journey. But let's look at some of these other verbs. So we have verbs of to go, to come, verbs of arise. So these examples can be multiplied, of course, and they're used, we'll look in more detail in a minute. They're used obviously to convey the prosaic truth that Jesus and his disciples go places, right? But there's a lot more going on. And so here's Joseph Ratzinger on kind of the deeper spiritual truth of this. The being of Christ is actualitas, stepping beyond itself, the exodus of going out from self. It is not a being that rests in itself, but the act of being sent, of being son, of serving. Conversely, this doing is not just doing, but being. It reaches down into the depths of being and coincides with it. This being is exodus, transformation, right? So you have this reality that Jesus is the one sent. The next time you read the gospel, pay attention to how many times Jesus, instead of calling God the Father, Father, says, the one who sent me, the one who sent me, the one who sent me. So Jesus's consciousness is formed as being the one who is sent by the Father. Balancing this out is another set. I don't think I have this on this slide. Oh, there's the reference for Ratzinger. There's a whole other set of verbs that you see especially strongly in the Gospel of John, the remaining verbs, the menane verbs, where Jesus abides, right? So you see this really beautifully in the Emmaus account, where you see both the movement of Jesus and the apostles, and then the disciples, and the disciples begging him, remain with us, right? So this remaining, the staying, is very important. Let's look at the discourse in the Last Supper, where we see a lot of these themes coming together. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, so that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I am going. Thomas, whose spiritual charism is to ask the obvious question that nobody is asking, right? Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So look at what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying he is the way where he is going, right? If I go, I will prepare a way for you. You know the way where I am going. And Thomas says, how can we know the way? I am the way where I am going. In other words, he's not just merely the way for us to follow, which is true, but he is himself the way where he is going.
What?
Hi there, Zoom person. We're glad you're here. So how is it that Jesus is the way where he is going? It's precisely because he is the one sent by the Father. Okay, this is only possible for a divine person, not for us human persons. But for Jesus, he is the procession from the Father. The Son is this eternal procession from the Father. And so when he becomes incarnate, that eternal reality is translated into this his earthly motion. But notice how this is also how we're invited in, right? So I will come so that where I am, there you may be also, right? So we're invited in to Jesus's motion, but also to Jesus's rest, to Jesus's stability. So let's get a little bit more into his divine person. So in John 13:3, John tells us that the incarnate Son had come from the Father and was going to the Father. So this is like a one-sentence summary of who the Son of God is. He is the one who comes from the Father and goes to the Father. And then when Jesus becomes incarnate, that takes on earthly form, right? That he comes from God, descends into the world to save us, and returns in the ascension to the Father. Balthazar, who's a theologian that I study, he points out that the very first chapter of John, we have Jesus described by the writer as the only begotten God who is into the bosom of the Father. I didn't put that up on the slide, but it's usually translated who is in the bosom of the Father, who is at the bosom of the Father, which is fine, except that it's actually an infinitive, which implies motion. And so we already get in the first chapter of John this sense that Jesus is this dynamic, the Son is this dynamic reality who is from and to the Father. Again, he can only do this because he is God, right? He can be this movement. So Balthazar says Christ, so he interprets this as meaning Christ's whole being is in motion from and toward the Father, which is an earthly movement as incarnate that reflects his eternal procession. So classically, so this is like a crash course in Trinitarian theology. And if you didn't understand a lot of that, that's fine, because my students don't often understand it either. But this is classically expressed in language calling the Trinitarian persons subsisting relations. And there you have both this fact of motion, movement, which I'm putting in scare quotes because it's not actually locomotion, but also stability of remaining. All right, so why am I making this argument? This is a very compressed argument to argue that both liquidity and solidity are goods. They're both part of who we are, and they're both reflected in God himself. Obviously, in God himself, differently than how we experience it. But it's really easy, as I'll talk about shortly, it's really easy to say, especially when you're surrounded by cultural relativism and, all kinds of weird fluidity and everything. It's really easy to say fluidity bad, solidity good. Not that you say it exactly that way, right? But where it's like, change I don't like, I'm going to find like the oldest, most solid institution and like stay in there and hope nothing changes. Which is totally understandable, but it's not actually how God made us. And it doesn't actually even reflect who God is in himself. So let me give you another example of kind of baptized fluidity, so to speak. This is a quote from Jean-Pierre de Caussade, which I think is really beautiful. He's talking about practicing the presence of Jesus in the current moment and abandoning to divine providence. And he says, in the state of abandonment, the only rule is the duty of the present moment. In this, the soul is light as a feather, liquid as water. Such souls have no more consistence and rigidity than molten metal. As this takes any form according to the mold into which it is poured, so these souls are pliant and easily receptive of any form that God chooses to give them. In other words, in the life of holiness, the liquidity that God calls us to is really an availability to be able to become whatever it is that God is calling us to be. And that's like the good truth of flexibility, right? Of what is good about it. I worked For a while, I volunteered with the Missionaries of Charity, which is Mother Teresa's sisters, you know, and the saris. They say it is not a sari, it is a habit, which is true. And they take such a serious vow of poverty that, you know, they could be told, like, in a week, you're moving from Harlem to Columbia. And they pack up their little shoebox with their spare habit and a couple books, and off they go. And that's like kind of an extreme version of this kind of availability. But it's a good thing for us to think about, those of us who aren't called to that kind of radicality, but that we're still called to this kind of availability to God. Another goodness of liquidity, you could think in terms of self-gift, that we're meant to pour ourselves out as Christ did. So here's Joseph Ratzinger again. The true God is of his own nature being for the Father, being from the Son, and being with the Holy Spirit. Yet man is in the image of God precisely because the being for, from, and with constitute the basic anthropological shape. In other words, like the basic reality of being a human being is that we come from, this is part of family, we are sent for, and we live with. And so this kind of self-gift is like a participation in this, this kind of divine fluidity, this self-giving reality of Christ. I want to look at a couple examples from the liturgy, just a couple. We can, I think, definitely see the evils of liquid modernity in the liturgy. I probably more than just about everybody in this room, because I'm older than most of you. So, you know, I suffered through the Wiccan parish volunteer post-it noting over male pronouns in the lectionary. Stephen maybe can relate. I don't know. You guys hopefully haven't encountered that kind of thing where there's kind of like anything goes sort of attitude towards the liturgy, where the priests are kind of making it up as they go, right? Like, so I think a lot of us have experienced that kind, well, some of us, hopefully you haven't, but I certainly have. So I think it's understandable that a lot of contemporary recourse to, say, the extraordinary form, or do we call it that? I always forget. Probably not anymore. Or to, like, say, other liturgical rites that have like more rootedness in history. I think that's a big part of their appeal. And I think that that is both a rational and, in fact, even kind of predictable reality. I find it so baffling that people are like, why is everybody going to these other rites? And I'm like, really? Have you been in a parish? Like it's obviously clear to me why people would have a preference for that. So we need solidity, but we do also need a sense of the flexibility. So our liturgies do, in fact, change over time. I find sometimes I'm not a liturgical theologian, so I don't have any great expertise on this, but you know, there's often a tendency to what I kind of call this looking for the snow globe liturgy among my seminarians, right? They're like looking for the perfect, most authentic liturgy they will kind of capture in a snow globe and never let it change again. And the truth is, like, there is no such liturgy, right? Like the post-Tridentine liturgy doesn't match the 3rd century liturgy. That doesn't mean we just change the liturgy willy-nilly the way it has happened often in the past 50 years or so. But there has to be a recognition that if we are looking for the liturgy to be absolutely solid, our place of refuge, we're going to be disappointed because we're ultimately looking in the wrong place. I also want to turn more specifically to the Eucharist as an example, particularly in the theology of Benedict XVI. He really frequently describes the Eucharist as the nexus of Jesus's self-giving, as the sacramental presence of Jesus's self-gift. And so let me give you this quote, also from Introduction to Christianity. For the Gospel of John, the picture of the pierced side forms the climax not only of the crucifixion scene, but of the whole story of Jesus. Now, after the piercing with a spear that ends his earthly life, his existence is completely open. You can see this is a big theme of Ratzinger's. Now he is entirely four. Now he is truly no longer a single individual, but Adam, from whose side Eve, a new mankind, is formed. And I think, in fact, in the Eucharistic species, we see both the solidity in the bread that remains in our tabernacles and in the wine that's poured out. So in both of the species of the Eucharist, we see this balance between the liquidity and the solidity that are there to nurture both of those sides of ourselves. So both the remaining and the constancy and also the self-gift. Okay, so a few practical takeaways, which you guys will come up with much better ones, I'm sure, in the discussion afterwards. But I think, first of all, it should be clear why the liturgy is such a lightning rod for a lot of these debates, because you can view it either through a liquid lens or through a solid lens. And so people on both kind of partisan sides can claim it for themselves. And it also can serve very easily as an identity shortcut, right? So it can become a means for Catholic identity politics really easily. We've also seen how the Eucharist fulfills both our solid desires and our liquid desires, right? So it is a flashpoint, but it actually is a place where we really are, all aspects of our being are nourished. We've also seen the challenges pertaining to community in liquid modernity. We unfortunately really lack a lot of guidance on how to form healthy community within the church and outside the church. People are really desperate for role models, and you can see this, I think, in how easily people turn to kind of YouTube or online influencers to kind of answer questions and settle things for them. But I think it's really important to realize that real community has to be ultimately rooted in embodied personal community. That online community is can be a real distortion of human community. So I think for all Catholics, there's a challenge for us, maybe especially in your age group, but I would say really for all Catholics, to pull back to some degree from online life and to really actively foster in-person life, which fortunately, since you're here, that means like you're hopefully already doing that, right, in your home colleges. And but I think people have to be really intentional about that. It can't just be, I think I'm doing that, I guess, whatever. Like the default is going to pull you like inevitably kind of into living out your life virtually. And that's because of forces much bigger than the individual. All right. Lastly, I'd like you to think about terms of identity in a particularly Christian key. And so this is maybe something you guys can talk about in those discussion groups. I honestly don't remember at all what the questions were. So hopefully they're related to what I actually talked about. I wrote the questions, but I don't remember them. It's who you are certainly has things to do with, who your family is and where you come from and what you study and yes, what college you go to and all of that. But the fundamental truth that kind of catches up and integrates these realities and makes them like a real narrative that has a purpose and a meaning, that fundamental truth is found in God's call to you, right? So if anything that's below God's call to you becomes the primary way that you form your identity, that's not really living up to truly Christian identity. And most of these ways, most of the things we use to form our identity are good. It's not like they're bad. I mean, there certainly can be bad ways, but generally, mostly we have these different competing goods, but the ultimate thing that's going to order all of those goods has to be God's call into your particular life, which is why discernment is so important, not just for your state of life, but kind of like, what's your mission? What's your call? That's the place where your solidity and fluidity really come together and are integrated. So with that, I think I'll end, and I'm really happy to hear your questions. Thank you.
Much. So we have about 10, 12 minutes for open discussion and questions here, and then we'll have a little break, and then we'll go back into our discussion groups. So if you can raise your hand, and then Jacques will handily bring this around.
Thank you. First of all, fantastic talk. That was amazing. Thank you. So while you were going through this in like the battle of liquidity versus solidity, the big thing that kept popping into my mind is something we see a lot in the Catholic Church of like the trad movement and this rejection of Vatican II and how everything went wrong in the church when we stopped doing things the way they used to be done. Because like you said, people don't want to see that change. They take comfort in the way things were. Like the church is turned away from what it always was. But I think that often comes from an ignorance of the fact that the church has always been liquid to a degree. Like it's had both solid and liquid elements, and that it's not a bad thing that it has the liquid elements. And while also, like you said, it's there, like there's a valid pull to that because a lot of liquidity we've seen has led to bad things. So it's very natural for us to like, there was good in that, what we saw before, let's retreat back to that. And there are definitely good things I think we can take out of the trad movement, but something that concerns me, especially in the topic, like in the greater conversation today of the inflection point, and we really need to step up to bring the church back and get people back in the church. I think the trad movement can be really repelling to people. It can be, it can seem dismissive towards people in the world that we live in today. It's ignorant of the world. It's rejecting the fact that the world moves forward. And so I guess all this is building to is a question of like, how do you think we marry the idea of keeping the benefits of that solid while also remaining open to the ever-changing world around us?
Yeah, thank you. So let me bracket traditionalism for a second. I'll come back to it. But the reason that the Catholic Church has survived, well, the reason is the Holy Spirit and Jesus Christ. But structurally, what the church is a very flexible institution, despite the fact that it is also extremely solid and needs to be. And the thing that I think of most particularly is the issue of development of doctrine. So that because within the Catholic Church, there's a hierarchy that continues in history and is like replaced by, it is able to address new historical questions in ways that churches that don't have that kind of theology, but are also very old. So I think of some of the Orthodox churches, like capital O Orthodox, they often have a hard time really engaging modern questions precisely because there's not as developed an understanding of development of doctrine in the sense that we have a magisterium that we can bring these questions to, so we don't have to be afraid of these questions because we have this structure that can address them. And so it's actually a huge part of the Catholic Church's historical strength that it is so liquid in that sense. I mean, the other obvious way that the Catholic Church is very liquid is that unlike, say the capital O Orthodox churches, it's not a national church. It's not an ethnic church. It's like literally small c Catholic, like it's universal. And that means, we've got all of these different rites. We have kind of all of these different local and cultural variations. And that also makes it very strong and very inviting. I also am concerned about aspects of traditionalism. I'm not inside of those movements, so I think that there's probably a lot of good that is quiet, that isn't as noisy, that you don't see. But certainly there are noisy, extreme elements of it that that ironically are very modern. They're very form your identity based on this idea that I came up with, right? Like one example I can think of that I rail against whenever I can is the idea in some traditionalist circles that that wives have to ask their husbands before they do anything, like anything, except maybe use the bathroom, right? And I'm thinking, nobody did this ever. Like, you can't do this before cell phones, right? Think, people, what? Like, you're in a field, like taking care of the animals, and you're going to try to run 3 miles and find your husband to ask if you can help the half be born? I mean, it's like, no, like we've formed to be like adult human beings. So, but that's just like an example of a very like actually modern way of thinking that depends upon a whole modern infrastructure, but also is like very much, I will come up with an idea that I think sounds right. And then like, this will just now be my new identity. And that's like a very kind of identity politics way of doing things. So I do definitely want to caution again, and I think you find it not just in kind of the more traditionalist sides, but certainly the more progressive sides of Catholicism as well, this kind of identity politics way of forming identity. Yeah, so sorry, that was a long answer.
Thank you for your talk. You teased a little about the gender fluidity and mentioned you might answer. So could you just speak a little bit about briefly?
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be short so we can have other questions. So basically, there's two different ways of thinking about gender kind of in the secular world that are actually at cross purposes with each other. So one is the hardcore trans idea that, you know, I was assigned female at birth, but inside I'm actually a man. And like, I am a man. And that's like actually a very solid way of understanding the sexes, right? Like, you know, I am a man and I want to be a man, and like they don't want anything to do with fluidity. The other is the kind of more classic Judith Butler way, which is like gender's fluid, and then morning I'll be a man and at noon I'll be a woman, and like that's okay. So they're kind of at cross purposes with each other, but I think it just makes sense that in a very liquid world, we're going to find whatever we can to liquidate. And so gender is, or, you know, being male or female is an obvious thing to try to liquidate. Yeah.
Hi, your talk was really very nuanced, and I have changed my perspective about the word liquid identity now. If you're into meme culture, it reminded me of She Got Us in the first half, and how the direction the talk went into. And you briefly mentioned in an answer to a question about the rigidity, but also the flexibility of the Catholic Church. And I wanted to ask something about that. I know the Catholic Church has a lot of hierarchies within it, and we're trying to keep a lot of different cultures and ethnicities together. And when you bundle that up with hierarchy, even when you say that it's going to be flexible, I feel like it's going to take a lot of time. And by the time we've changed, we've already lost, you know, many people. Like maybe St. Paul talks about, I forget in which book, if women don't cover their heads in the church, shave their head or something like that. But now it's now we don't even think about it. But how long would it have taken from us to go from there to be here right now? Sort of like open markets, right? It works well in theory, but how long until the prices of the goods most in demand go down? So do you feel that the layered hierarchy of the Catholic Church right now is holding us back and maybe costing us the believers and their experiences right now? Have you looked into it, and do you have any thoughts on how we could make this process more streamlined so that with a world that is changing really quickly, we also need maybe a Catholic Church that can respond much faster to these new ideas?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I would say, first of all, ideally, and so obviously the church is very big and it's been around a long time, and we have all different kinds of experiences of it. Ideally, hierarchy is there to protect the rest of it, right? And so, like in the example of dogmatic development, hierarchy is there to safeguard this process of dogmatic development. And if you don't have a hierarchy, you don't in fact have dogmatic development. Basically in a lot of Protestant, like American Protestant churches, dogmatic development works by, I'm leaving this church and starting my own. Like but that's not development, that's just schism, right? And so that's like a solid, right? It's like, I can't change this, so we're gonna cut it in half. So ideally hierarchy should be the safeguard. And so that provides the the balancing solidity to what otherwise could just be kind of chaos, but what in fact would probably be just multiple schisms, if I had to guess. I'll leave it there. It's an interesting question that you're asking, but I want to give time for maybe one more.
I thought it was really interesting the way that you chose to define modernity as like an absence of a truth rather than an embracing of an individual truth. Why is it that you chose to define it that way as opposed to the other way?
Oh, I wish I could talk about this for a long time. So I have a book coming out. So my first volume of Body and Identity is an intellectual history. And in it, I argue, so there's kind of this postmodern myth that like in modernity, you get this really solid, robust, individualistic self, and postmodernity is there to like, fight the subject and say none of that, liquefy the subject. In fact, I think it's quite clear as you kind of trace the intellectual development within modernity that the self gets emptier and emptier because of that rejection of truth or formal causality. There's no one reality that defines who the human being is. And basically, more or less, the idea, especially after the wars of religion and everything, the idea becomes, if we believe in firm truths, that makes people kill each other. It's kind of like the early version of the 9/11 stuff Stephen was talking about, right? So if we believe in truths, we're going to have civil war, people will kill each other. So we'll become officially agnostic about truth and just create structures that enforce tolerance and along the way make everybody rich, right? So like it's like, let's switch the focus from like a common good to a focus on prosperity. And I don't oppose prosperity at all, but there is this lamentable lack of a good that's supposed to structure society. And so that the human being kind of follows because the human being gets emptier and emptier and is given more to do and less to be, basically. So you already have it in Locke that I am formed by my memory of my consciousness. And that means I am totally self-constructed. My identity is totally self-constructed. But what am I conscious about? Like, what's the good? Who am I really? Like, he doesn't, like, he's like, I can't answer that question. You probably can't answer that question. Like, we're just conscious of who we are, right? So it becomes, we're always circling around this empty middle. And that's in some ways like the what used to be in the empty middle was an account of the good and the true, right? And so I think that's why all sorts of like, not just the person and identity, but all kinds of institutions kind of get hollowed out because you're not supposed, if you have an account of the good, it means you want to kill me, right? And so we're not supposed to do that. One more, all right.
Right. So it seems to me that the idea of fluidity and the idea of being able to choose like a self identity or like a shelf identity might come from the fact that the society is more connected. So there's more people around you that might possibly have the same type of shelf identity. So whereas back in, Heidelberg in the old times, everybody around you were the same thing. So you would not even think about getting a new identity because the community gave it to you. And so do you think that happens in the church as well, where it can be more fluid these days because of the fact that we're more connected with each other? And if yes, then is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And how do we deal with it?
Yeah. So part of what you're describing has to do with greater socio-political changes, right? So greater urbanization, greater mobility. A lot of this is happening, in the 14th and 15th centuries. This is like an old history. And it's triggered by all kinds of things, but I keep saying it's partly triggered by Christianity, right? Like you can leave your home and your family because God might be calling you to be a missionary or whatever. These things do get liquefied. And I think that's not a bad thing in and of itself. But it can become a bad thing. I think I'd push back a little bit on the idea that we're more connected. Our networks might be bigger, but I'm not sure that being in the middle of a big network is the same thing as being connected. I think it might actually work against that. And so it's definitely the case that we can find whoever has our particular weird fetish or whatever, like we can find those people online for sure. That is actually not the same thing as like kind of organically developing a sense of self through like personal relationships that exist in a kind of healthier, but even just kind of more human, normal, natural kind of human way. All right. Thank you, everyone.